Good evening, everyone. My name is Yoni Michani, and I'm Camera's Campus Advisor and Strategic Planner. This evening, we will have the pleasure to hear from Masha Gabriel and Marcelo Huillo and their insightful work with the media in the Spanish world. Masha Gabriel is the director of Revista de Medio Oriente, Camera's Spanish language division. Born in Argentina and raised in Spain, Masha monitors the Spanish language media in outlets from Spain, Latin America, and the US, and tries to ensure that reporting about Israel and the region is both balanced and accurate. With a background in journalism, television, and film, Masha has intimate knowledge of Spain's journalistic world. In her previous capacity as director of a Madrid radio program, she interviewed journalists and politicians from around the world. Welcome, Masha. Marcelo Huillo is the Associate Director of Camera Spanish Department. He received his BA in journalism from Buenos Aires. He's worked as a freelance journalist for different media outlets in Spanish, writing about many different subjects. He's also worked in the radio of Spain's Jewish Federation. Currently, as part of his work with Camera, he writes about anti-Semitism and issues related with Israel in different media outlets, in both Spanish and English. Before we get started, let me briefly say something about the structure of tonight's evening event. It will include a 25-minute discussion with our guests, and then a lengthy 30-minute Q&A session with questions from the audience. If you run your cursor along the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A icon. Please submit your questions during the talk, and I will take as many as I can afterwards. So without further ado, let's begin. Masha, let's start with you. Before anything else, why is Camera needed in the Spanish world?
Camera is an organization, more than 35 years old organization, that works promoting an accurate coverage of Israel and the Middle East. And it has different departments, different branches, different languages. Like we have Arabic, Camera in Hebrew, of course in English. And you were asking why in Spanish? Well, Spanish is the second most spoken language in the world, and is the second most spoken language in the United States too. Listen, and it's expected that by 2060, a third of the US population will be Latina. This gives you an idea of how important it is to approach and especially to debunk the lies that have been spread around in the Spanish-speaking media. And there's no other organization. We are the only Spanish-speaking organization that works with the Spanish-speaking media, promoting this accurate coverage. And we work with different, geographically, it's a wide world. We have from South America to Latinos in the United States and Spain too.
Wow, those statistics about the Spanish-speaking world and the expansion is unbelievable and fascinating. Marcelo, is this work essentially then a question of language?
No, I wouldn't say so. Language is only a tool to communicate. That in the very specific case of Spanish as a first language, connects so many different cultures and countries. So because of these and because of the easiness to get access through the internet to the media, a large percentage of population share practically the same information, which the case of our interest that of the Middle East issues has its origins in Spain, that is in its major media outlets. And this is so simply because the Spanish media is the only one that can afford to have a correspondence in the region. So that the media of the American continent, the Spanish-speaking media, mostly echoes what they produced. Now, I would like to just point out three of the most important or most influential media outlets from Spain. That would be the news agency, EFE, the only one in Spanish with a bureau in Jerusalem, the newspaper El País, and the public radio and television entity. It's like it's a sort of a Spanish version of this BBC. which broadcasts worldwide through its international TV channel and radio. And actually, the radio, you can get it through any app in your mobile phone.
Yeah, I would like to add something to what Marcelo is saying to explain a little bit more about the origins of this information, which is Spain. Spain has a very particular relationship with Jews. I mean, as you might know, in 1492, Jews were expelled from Spain. And they didn't come back, they didn't go back to Spain until like around 200 years ago, which means that for centuries in Spain, you had an imaginary of a mean, evil Jew, and you didn't have a real Jew to see that this was a lie. So they used to say that in Spain, they like to say that Spain made up the anti-Semitism without Jews. So you have the idea of a mean, evil Jew, but you don't have a real Jew to contrast this idea. And actually still today, I mean, it's not very used, but still today you use a word like judiada, which is an act committed by a Jew, to say that this person has made something mean. This person has made he's a thief, he's a judío, is something mean. And this is one important aspect to understand that Spain grew up without Jews, but with an idea of a mean Jew. And also something important, which is more modern, but also an historical aspect that I think is very important, is the Second World War. Spain was not directly involved in the Second World War. Therefore, when Europe was rebuilt on the ashes of the Holocaust and trying to learn a lesson from it, which of course we can discuss if Europe did it or not, but the Holocaust is an important, I would say a tool, I mean, it's not the word, but it's an important aspect in rebuilding Europe. Spain was not there. Spain was behind its borders. It was not in this part. So it was aside the history, the modern history and the old history of the Jews, which gives a sort of lack of knowledge about Judaism, Zionism, and a big superficiality.
And I would add the persistence of it, because one would have imagined that through time, it would somehow dilute it without any Jews, but it persisted.
I think it's incredibly important to understand that, in essence, what the absence of Jews in Spain led to. And I think, like Marcelo was saying, I want to reiterate and highlight that essentially the corrections that you're managing to do in outlets from Spain that in essence stream into smaller outlets of South America, when you make a correction there, you're essentially making a correction for millions of Latin American citizens to see from their respective outlets. And that's just astounding.
Right.
So, Masha, you mentioned superficiality. What do you mean by that?
I mean, this lack of knowledge and the not understanding. We've been in touch with some of the medias that Marcel has mentioned have been publishing stuff that are absolutely libeled. And you cannot imagine like such a big, for instance, a paper published, El País published in 2017, I think it was an op-ed, where the author was saying that the Zionists were the beginning of all the problems in the Middle East. It was also guilty of the jihadism, the theocracy in Iran, and even the 9/11. Everything was Zionist. When you talk to them and you say, this is a libel, this is a lie and a libel, they understand it's not true, but they don't understand. There's no an alarm that says, wait, this could be this could be anti-Semitism. And this is an example, but there are several of them. For instance, the Spanish BBC, Radio Televisión Española. There was a big documentary about the tramway in Jerusalem. And the last sentence was saying, despite the coexistence, Jews are majority. So despite the coexistence, they are majority, which means that if they're a majority, they cannot be a coexistence. And when you mention this, they don't get it, which is something very interesting. There are other countries that are not only Spain, of course. You had in Argentina a channel that was saying that Canal 5, Channel 5, who was accusing Israel to be behind the COVID-19, which is also libel. But you see an indignation in Argentina and you see some revolt that in Spain is kind of, you need to explain why this is a problem.
Yes, I remember that incident with the with the Channel 5 in Argentina. And that leads me into my next question for Marcelo. How would you then define the treatment of Israel and essentially Jews in the media?
In general, I would say that I would define it as the product of a widespread lack of professionalism, which in the case of this particular coverage seems to have become somehow the model of the journalistic work. So this manifests itself in the Spanish coverage, I think, that through two central issues. And I mean central because they end up defining the product, that is the story that the audiences get. One of the issues is the biased treatment of sources and of information, and that of voices, in what already seems to be an almost systematic lack of corroboration and contextualization of the information provided by these, and in the lack of correct identification of these sources of voices. And by this I mean the identification of their interests in the conflict. And the other aspect, central aspect, I would say, is the omission of relevant facts. After all, it seems that what is omitted doesn't exist. So in this way, and besides many other things, for example, Israel concerns and the threats that the Jewish state face, such as terrorism, are constantly dismissed.
Just one thing on the terrorism Marcelo is mentioning, it's an example that I think is very interesting. It's EFE, the wire agency, the only Spanish wire agency with a bureau chief in Jerusalem. They made 3 big interviews to Leila Khaled, Ahed Tamimi, and Ashrawi. And well, anyway, the interviews were like a tabloid interview. They seemed like stars. There was no single difficult question. They were not confronting them with the same lies they were saying. But the interesting thing in the interview with Khaled, who's the first woman who hijacked an airplane, there was not a single mention of the word terrorism. They didn't say that nothing that the organization she belongs to is a terrorist organization. The only moment where the word terrorist was written and mentioned is when Leila Khaled was accusing Israel of committing terrorist actions.
Well, I'm sorry. The fact is that neither EFE nor in the most of the Spanish language media is there any mention to the what I would call the Palestinian leadership vision of the conflict, right? And how they envision its resolution. By this I mean what they actually understand by resolution of the conflict. And it is certainly not very difficult to find examples of the views, of the statements of these same leaders, and the charters of the PLO, for example, and its majority organization, Fatah. For example, just one example, the Article 8 of Fatah Constitution says that the Israeli existence in Palestine is a Zionist invasion. That's an explicit non-recognition of Israel's right to exist. Not to mention, of course, the charter of Hamas, which actually very recently, one of the top officials of Hamas called for the killing of Jews wherever they are around the world. And strikingly, you get that these facts that are so evident and important to understand the conflict, along with the many statements and actions by the Palestinian along this line, they are consistently omitted when, for example, something very easy, covering the issues regarding the negotiations. So one would ask, how are the audiences supposed to get an appropriate picture of the reality of the conflict and of the real possibilities of a peaceful resolution if such important information is concealed? And how are they then supposed to grasp Israel's concerns? And of course, added to this, there is also no mention about the Palestinian and Hamas systematic and official incitement to violence and hatred, neither about the corruption among its leadership or about the state of human rights in the territories administered or controlled by Fatah or Hamas. And about Hamas, there's never a word about the diversion of funds and resources to building, for example, terror tunnels to infiltrate Israel, or to making rockets and to indiscriminately attack Israel. So I think that at the end of all these, or at the end, that this is part of what in camera we came to call, especially Masha, came to call it the big omission. That is the omission of first of all, the Arab aggressions, and afterwards of the refusal to commit to peace and to take the necessary steps to build a state every single time they've been offered with the opportunity to do it. And actually, Masha has a very interesting article published on this subject in one of the major newspapers in Spain. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was a Confidencial.
Confidencial, yes.
Yeah. It's worth reading. I don't know if we did actually translate it or not.
I don't remember.
Because it probably would be worth translating it into English.
So, after all of this, Masha, I'm left with the question, why the silence? I mean, after all, isn't it essential to understand one of the key actors?
Yes, but I think it's very important to understand that there's a narrative that has already been created. And this narrative has also created a demand of keeping this narrative going on. So in this, the way the journalists in Spain, in Spanish, frame the conflict or anything that happens around Israel and the Middle East, you will see that in general, or I could say almost always, Israel is the subject of the action. So, and the Palestinians are always going to be the object. So, for instance, if there's a rocket, if Hamas sends rockets against the south of Israel, the headline will be the response of Israel. If you're lucky, they're going to mention that there's a response, but that's another chapter. And that's really interesting because it shows you a sort of double standards, as if the Palestinians were never moral agent. The Palestinians, you never see, like Marcelo was mentioning, the big omission. You never see, every time they say no to negotiations, you don't see the incitement to violence. They never do. They are always victims. And in this double standard, there was a headline, I think 2 headlines on a row on 2 different days from the wire agency EFE, that I think it's interesting to highlight it, because the first one was Israeli dies from a rocket during a riot in the West Bank. So he dies from a rocket. There's no Palestinian behind, no one behind, is a rocket. And during a riot, which means there's a violent context. The next day, the headline from the same wire agency is Palestinian miner shot by Israeli soldiers. That's it. In the second one, you have the Israeli soldier who's the subject, the one who leads the action. And there's no context, because we have to say that this was during a confrontation also, but they don't say that. So with the headlines, you have this clear double standards, and this is something that you do with all the media, or most of all the media, and you can see that the difference in how they treat the information. And most of all, always is Israel is the subject.
So we've spoken about headlines.
Sorry, let me jump in. I would like to. She mentioned again I think this is a very good example of double standards, and especially of how a professional takes sides, because and it is critical, because as we see the media in Spanish. They are very successful in telling the audience what to think about. They do so by emphasizing certain issues. So through repeated and sometimes, as in this very case of the conflict, exaggerated coverage of certain issues, the audience come to judge them as important, as outstanding. But not just that, they are not all the time, but sometimes successful in telling audiences how to think about those very subjects. And they do so by framing them in very different ways. And thus what they do is they influence the public's perspectives on very key aspects of these issues. I think it's very important to bear in mind that most of these frames are defined not only by what they include, but what they leave out as well, what we call about the omissions. And in addition to this, the headlines in the Spanish media have become sort of a very essential tool in this framing the news stories, as they have ended functioning like very too often, like a sort of a key that tells the reader how to interpret the text that follows. So, as Masha was I think she pointed out, the headlines in Israel, they also Israel in the headlines is also portrayed as the active, responsible, and more than presumably guilty subject. And it is in this point of view, from this point of view, from which whatever follows the headlines must be read, and most of it evaluated, right?
And I think that's brilliantly and simply put. And so that leads me to my next question for Masha. We've spoken about headlines, we've spoken about sources and double standards, and we've touched on omissions in today's evening event. But for you, what would be the most characteristic problem of journalism in the Spanish media?
So I would say there's a clumsiness in the facts, in the historical facts. We could see El País saying that the conflict started in 1967. And when you tell them that's not true and you give them all the explanation, there was no correction on this matter. The other day, like last week, there was EFE publishing, the Radio Televisión Española, the TV, saying that starting in 1948, the Palestinians have been like constantly losing their land. And even media that use the famous three math like their lies. And that's something that I feel is it's really clumsy on one hand. And on the other hand, something that Marcelo mentioned that is very important, I think the sources. For one reason that I still don't really know, maybe because there's a lack of language, because I know there are journalists that have issues not only with Hebrew, but also with English. Maybe it's not true anymore, but some of them used to. There are problems with sources. You can read the same sources everywhere and sources without any context.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with this last statement. This is it's probably one of the biggest problems among many with the Spanish cover, because, and here I would like to add or make a distinction between sources of information, those that give an account of the event to the journalist, just about what happened, and the voices that mainly offer opinion and interpretation in very different forms, as as an accusation, an expression of position, or a feeling. And when I say accusation, it comes to my mind immediately Saeb Erekat. And these voices in the Spanish coverage are very often confused with that of the reporters, because he uses them to convey to the reader a position, a very particular position, a very particular point of view. And besides this, even many of what they are presented or suggested as sources of information are mere voices, again. And in this way, numerous NGOs or so-called social movements or individuals who are far from being mere observers or neutral actors have been promoted to the rank of a sort of a priority and unquestionable source of information. And so they are exempted from all scrutiny, and the organization, the person, or the institution, or whatever they have asserted, instantly become the news, and most commonly the truth about conflict. In short, it becomes the narrative, not of one of the parties, but of the story itself.
Right. So I could stay here and chat with you guys all night until tomorrow. But I do want to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions, because I do see that we have a variety of very interesting questions lined up for this evening. Before we do that, I would like to ask you each a final question. First for Masha, how does your department operate?
Well, we get in the mornings, normally with the biggest coffee we can find, and we started reading everything that has been written about Israel. Sometimes you start even at 4 a.m. because, as we say, the news started in Spain, so we have a little gap. And we read everything. We double check. When we see a problem, we get in touch with the editors, with the journalists. We send emails. We actually even sometimes meet with them. Right now I'm in Spain because I come here from time to time. We come normally twice a year to meet with the editors, and we try to get corrections. We explain, and sometimes we get it, and we are very happy. And sometimes we have to fight a little bit more. And if we can't, we have all our supporters who send emails and go on social media, which I want to thank all of them from here, because thanks to them, we are able to we're strong enough.
Oh, that's fantastic. And so Marcelo, when we're talking about contacting editors and your particular relationship with different outlets, in your experience, how do they usually respond?
Well, it's tricky and depends on the country, right? But usually, if they care a bit about the quality of what they do, they sometimes respond, not all the time. When they do, they may dispute what we point out, and eventually, and from time to time, they correct. But the thing is that, for example, in the Spanish media, it's very different regarding correction. It's not like the English-speaking media. Basically, they are not very well, how to put it, disposed to correct, right? Actually, I remember once, I think it was Masha, I don't know, that we were told on some occasion by some editor that, okay, we'll correct this, but you cannot say that you had any doing in it. Yeah? So, as Masha said, we have to work hard, almost like diplomats, sometimes like warriors, and some others, and but we do get corrections. We are very persistent, and we're like bees or I don't know, flies over there. We insist.
I want to say something that big improvements have been made, and that's also something that, because we've been talking about problems, but there've been big improvements, like mentioning the media. Marcel was saying before, for instance, when we started with Revista El País, used to say that Tel Aviv was the capital of Israel. It's not anymore a capital of Israel for El País either. I mean, we had a long conversations. Also, Radio Televisión Española, Marcelo got an email where they were committing that from now on they're going to say that Hamas is a terrorist group. We don't know if they're going to do it, but we have to be there, and we have an email where they are committing to that. With EFE, we can say that we didn't get any email, but they're being more careful. They normally don't say so easily that the Palestinian territories that they used to say before. And I insist, this is, of course, thanks to this work, this persistence we do, but mostly thanks to our supporters. Because without those people supporting us on social media, that every time we do something, they're there, they send us email, or sending emails when they ask them to send emails, or even when they just send us articles that are wrong. Without that, it would be very difficult. And of course, with the financial support, which is also extremely important for the work we do. And there are people who are helping us with that. And the whole thing is what is like making our job possible. And I think thanks to that also, we've been able to get all those corrections and keep getting corrected.
It seems like like a web of support beneath an acrobat trying to cross in a tight rope. So you're very secure in your work because you know they are down there, and if you fall, well, you bounce up and you will be back there.
No, absolutely. And so with that said, I'd like to move towards the Q&A portion of tonight's event. We do have a great number of questions, very interesting, that have been submitted throughout the event. So without further ado, I'd like to start with this one directed towards Masha. What is Iran's involvement with Spanish media outlets?
Well, a big one, not only with media, also in the politics. Iran has been involved with Latin America. I mean, I don't know if, well, probably they do. They remember the 26 years ago, the Ami attack, and 2 years before, the attack on the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. This has been like considered an act from Hezbollah. And we also can talk about the tribal border, which is also, there's an important infiltration of Iran through the diplomats in South America. Regarding the media, they have the same way that they have Press TV in American media. In Spanish, they have Hispan TV. I know they're facing important economical problems. So I've read, but you never know. I mean, it's not clear, still not clear enough. I've read that they were not going to be able to keep broadcasting some of the problems, but they've been doing this. And it's not only them. I mean, Hezbollah also was interested in broadcasting into Spanish. And you have, I mean, all the media are trying to broadcast into Spanish, and especially in the anti-Israeli, of course, because it's an important population that they're going to reach to.
No, that's extremely fascinating, and I'm sure you can talk for hours on end about Iran's involvement in Spanish media outlets. So Marcelo, a question for you. What would you suggest in order to prevent the dissemination of labels, biased reporting, and anti-Semitism in the Spanish-speaking media? In essence, what do you think we can do, we as in the audience, rather than wait and react every time?
Oh, that's a good and tough question. I think education is very important. The education that Camera offers to students here in the colleges could be probably, well, I'm just imagining, but it could be taken to many other countries, so that they don't have the same contact to this kind of information that we offer to the facts. Because they have no way of getting them. There are no organizations in the country that monitor the media, or even that are aware what universities and schools are teaching. So I think it's doing what we are doing, getting more effort in what we're doing. And eventually we'll get there. I don't think that there's much more, but growing, of course. That would be the ideal answer, right? Growing and being able to reach many other countries, many other communities, and bring in the material, the lot of material that Camera has, and being able to translate that material into different languages, not just Spanish, but French and other kind of languages. So people get in touch with, at least once, with something different.
I think, you said something very beautiful in that we'll get there. And I think that in 2020, You know, that's a very refreshing, optimistic outlook, and it's necessary. And I think one of the important things to keep in mind is that one of the reasons why we're successful in what we do is because we believe that we're working towards, you know, a future where one day we won't have to deal with these problems. And so I think that was brilliantly said.
Actually, you know, this crisis that brought this this way of communicating via Zoom and many virtual platforms, well, they could be useful to get in touch with other people that we wouldn't have get in touch with.
Right.
It's a very good, for example, exploiting this kind of things. It's a way of getting there.
Of course. Of course. So, Masha, I see here a question specifically for you. Since the New York Times appears to have a vocabulary deficit when it comes to mentioning terrorism, when covering the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is there any difference that you see between this style of reporting and similar reporting in Spanish outlets?
It's difficult. I don't monitor the New York Times, so I cannot really say too much about it specifically, but with my coworkers, we've seen similarities. So in Spain, the media who wants to be the New York Times is called El País. It's like, yeah, the most influential paper in Spanish. It's not the most read anymore. It used to be, but not anymore, but influential. Actually, you had Bernie Sanders said that he used to read El País in Spanish. So yes, there are similarities. El País, I think, wants to be the New York Times because, but still, I think, I have the feeling that I mean, it's not a good moment to say that, but I have the feeling that in the New York Times, at least until a couple of years ago, or maybe even less, you could have different voices. You could hear different point of view about the same topics. And El País is very difficult when it comes to Israel. It's very, very difficult. You can from time to time, but it's Herculean. I don't know if you say that, a very big job to do to get to when someone writes it there. And also the clumsiness. I mean, I feel that when I see the problems in the New York Times, they can be difficult, they can be terrible, but there's a sort of it's not so clumsy, I have the feeling. But again, I don't follow the New York Times, so I cannot make this comparison. Anyway, I remember coming to the United States to live, and people were shocked around me when I was mentioning some of the things that the Spanish media were doing, and because the mainstream was doing it. But things are improving also, so yeah.
Let me add that I think I have the impression that the media in Spanish, they have adopted more openly and uncritically the lexicon of the Palestinian leadership. So it has become a bit of the feeling you have when you read an article is that you have a narrative, but it's not the narrative anymore of one of the parts of the Palestinian part, but it's the narrative of the news story, which is quite strikingly, or not much, but it's worrisome.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely it is. And then a question for either of you. Let's go with Masha, because Masha is there on the ground. What is it there, 2 in the morning?
Yeah, almost, yeah.
Okay. So thank you for being with us so
Thank you.
so late. But Masha, approximately how many Jews would you say there are in Spain? And do you feel that anti-Semitism is somewhat mainstreamed in Spain?
So the number of Jews is not very clear because you don't have, not all the Jews have been I mean, you don't know how many there are. There was a big wave of Jews coming from South America, especially from Argentina, at the end of the 90s. I would say around 20,000, 40,000. This is, I mean, I think they say 40,000 is like the official number. And there is a sort of anti-Semitism, but it's very interesting because it's kind of a soft anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is constantly there, everywhere. I mean, I was mentioning like the history is very difficult when you hear your friends telling you don't do a chuliada or don't be a Jew. Well, I'm sorry, I am. It's something that is there, and it's something that, I mean, you know what? Dead Jews are okay. They're not going to say, they're going to say it's the Inquisition was bad, Holocaust is terrible. The only problem they have is with this imaginary Jew they have, because they had an idea of centuries of not knowing Jews. They have an imaginary Jew, they have an imaginary Jew in their mind, and they have an imaginary Zionism in their mind. What happens in Spain right now is also that politically, we have a party that is in the government that is very close to the BDS and to the anti-Israeli movements, which I would say the anti-Israeli, I mean, it's a little bit more accepted that we would like to.
Mm-hmm. Marcelo, Camera is a non-partisan organization. I do think, though, that this question is still relevant for the audience. Is the anti-Israel bias in the press of Spain duplicated in Central and South America and US press? And can the bias, wherever it appears, be said to be more common in the right or left-wing media outlets?
Well, we don't have a great sample of Central America media. The media in Spanish in the US, I wouldn't say so. Some are quite different, and some are neutral. We don't find a bad coverage of Israel. They're mostly interested in other subjects. So Israel is the least of their interests. The kind of in South America, I have the feeling that it wasn't so bad. It got back recently, mainly when they started, as we spoke, picking up the news from Spain and not writing them anymore. And in Argentina in particular, that's the country with most Jews. I think that the problem comes from the left wing. The left wing parties and media that are starting to be openly, slowly, they try, you know, it's like they try to see what the reaction is. They say something and they try. It's like it's more trial and error to see what happens if they say this or that. For example, what we were talking about, the channel, the C5 channel, that's a channel close to the Kirchner party. And so, yeah, I would say that in Argentina, it's mostly the left wing. And in Spain, oh, it's so difficult because, I mean, politically speaking, I would say the problem would be more lean to the left right now. But when it comes to the media, it's so it's difficult. It's everywhere, and they are starting. Like 10 years ago, I would see differences between one media and the other. Now I don't see many difference between a serious newspaper and a left-wing pamphlet, right? Less and less you see that kind of difference.
And I think it's fascinating that in Spain and Argentina, we see some similar trends that we're witnessing around the globe, that right-wing anti-Semitism has become easier to detect a lot of the times than maybe left-wing anti-Semitism. And I think that's, you know, truly fascinating.
Sorry, because right-wing anti-Semitism is easily defined as anti-Semitism.
Right.
Because we're used to see the anti-Semitism, or we thought that the anti-Semitism would come from the right. We didn't understand what the anti-Semitism was. We just understood that it came from the right. And when it comes from the left, we are not able to say, to define this is anti-Semitism, because it comes from another place where we're not expecting it. And this is one of the things where we are fighting a lot. But what Marcelo says is very interesting. It's true that, for instance, we have media that are right media that you would expect a better coverage, and they're very problematic too. And you have people who are from the right who are problematic, and people from the left. So we are non-partisan in camera. So we don't take sides. We try really not to focus too much on whether it comes from the right or from the left. So we focus on the fact per se, which is if it is or it's not anti-Semitic.
And I think it makes it easier to be nonpartisan when you know that anti-Semitism can come from either side.
Right.
So is the bias on the part of the Spanish language, Masha, this question is directed to you, arise from incurable prejudice, honest ignorance, or some lack of effectiveness on the part of Israeli media relations that can possibly be rectified?
So I don't think that prejudice come from the people who have been prejudiced about. I don't know how to say. I mean, I don't think that if there's anti-Semitism, it's never the fault of the Jews. It's because of those who made it wrong. This said, I really think that Israel has been for years not too interested in the Spanish-speaking world. And sometimes it's very difficult to, so I said we double check every time we read something, we need to ask our own sources what happened. Sometimes it's difficult, but I don't know what Israel could do. I think when a society is being anti-Semitic, the problem is in this society. And I really think that I mean, I don't want to give an idea of Spain as an old country anti-Semitic, because it's a modern country. There's the prejudices have been like overcome, but you have very smart people, but we don't speak enough. We don't say this enough. Things are changing. There are new people. There are organizations, Spanish organizations, who are doing a great job fighting also on even, I mean, there's an organization in Spain that I call that fights against they sue the BDS. They're winning a bunch of low bottles, but and what we do with the media, that I really think it's effective, even if sometimes they pretend to ignore us, but it's effective. And I think there's a lot that is being done right now, but I also think that it's just sort of, we're in the middle of a trend, you know, like a global trend. And the situation right now, people are very emotional, and it's difficult to put a little bit of reason in the middle of this sea of emotions. And this is what we are doing. Actually, this is what I think that camera does most of all. In the middle of an emotion, we say, wait, let's look at the facts. We just look at the facts. And this is something that I'm very optimistic. And I feel that because we've had arguments with media for years, and one specific for 3 years, at the end, after those 3 years, I got the correction. And you say, yes, you say, well, 3 years for no correction. No, because the problem is not that they're gonna correct what happened before, is that they're not gonna repeat the mistake. So I think I'm optimistic, even though I feel that it's very, very difficult and tiring sometimes.
It also lets you build a relationship with the outlet once they accept the correction, you know, right in the future. Would you say that they become more open to hearing more suggestions? Yes
and no. I mean, yes, sometimes they just like, oh, they see your email and like, oh my goodness, you again, what's wrong now? So, you know, there are a lot of changes. So you have, you create a good relationship with the person who is in charge of the foreign office and in one paper, and a year later he's in somewhere else, and there's another person you don't know, and there's so much. The media are so they're swimming in a pool of politics. So it's very difficult sometimes. Even meeting with you becomes already something difficult.
Right, and I think one of the most important things you said is that essentially you're not working alone in Spain. You have significant partners on the ground that are helping you. You know.
Well, we work alone. I mean, we Canada works. We don't. I mean, we don't partner. I mean, like I was trying to answer to the question about the.
No, as far as having resources there that you can sometimes, you know, receive tips or suggestions.
Oh, well, yeah. I don't know, and especially people. Again, like the people here, when I come here, I also meet with some of those who like send you the articles, and some of them, like, I remember, he doesn't do it anymore. I'm going to tell him to do it again. He was sending me the article and he was like highlighting all the problems, explaining what the solution was. I think, oh, this is great. We have, yeah, we meet people, but we work on our own. I mean, we are, because what we do, because we're non-partisan, because we want to be sure that every single thing we do is accurate, we are just working on our own. Sometimes we, of course.
Yeah, and besides, well, we do specifically, we are the only ones actually doing it. No one takes the work of going through the coverage and checking and verifying. And then when we write an article about it, if I write an article, Masha looks at it and we double check and we check 3-4 times. No one does that. In Spanish, it's just us.
I think it's very difficult, of course, outside of camera, to find that people do that in English as well. You know, so we do have time for 2 very short questions. The first one directed for Marcelo. Are there any submissions or letters to editors of Spanish media outlets that present positive views of Judaism and Israel?
There are. It's not usual, but from time to time, yeah, they are. I don't know the strength or the difference of the tradition of letter writing from English media to the Spanish media. I think it's different. For example, when I was in Argentina or in Spain, I wouldn't read the letters at all. I would read the editorial, the op-eds, I would read the news, but I wouldn't read the letters. But there are groups of letter writers that write on behalf of not of Israel, but of Israel's facts.
Right.
And we are in contact with them. They ask us about information and they want to check the facts, and so they ask for facts and backgrounders to us. We do have them.
And we've had a lot of, I mean, letter writers for us that have been able to publish in different papers. But it's true what Marcel says, especially in the last, I would say in the last 2 years, the weight of the letters in the Spanish world has been, I don't know what happens now, they don't publish as much. And
no, and even the quality, I think that is done very, very down. So,
but opinions are still relevant.
Yes. Indeed.
Okay.
Writing an opinion to get published in a newspaper, that we do that a lot. As I mentioned, Masha got that one in El Confidencial. We wrote here in La Opinión de Los Angeles. We wrote in Clarín, the most important in Argentina. We wrote in Whitenet in Spanish. So yeah, we are there. We write. Masha wrote something also in Independiente, another important media outlet in Spain. So we do write, and sometimes we try to get published some interesting views of people we know in those same
that's
different kind of media.
That's very insightful. And so that ultimately leads us to the last question, which I'd like to direct to Masha. Masha, what can we do as the audience to help you during this very difficult journey that, as Marcelo said, will hopefully finish sometime in the near future? But what can we do to contribute, to help, or to even fight alongside you?
Well, you can help us. Follow us on Twitter. Let us know that you're there. Retweet stuff on social media.
We're on Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah, so, yeah. If you see any problem, if you see an article with a problem, send it to us. If you like something, send us an email saying, "Oh, that was good," because sometimes it's good to hear that what you're doing has having feedback. And if you see we have a problem, of course, tell us we have a problem. And I mean, be with us. And of course, like financial support, if you can, that's very important too. So whatever can be done to help us, as I was saying before, all those different ways of this approach is like writing, alerting us, and following us, helping us with economically, everything works. Everything is very helpful for us.
That's phenomenal. And I'd like to take one last chance to really thank our panelists for presenting their work this evening from all around the world, as well as Camera's incredible development team, and of course to tonight's audience for participating in this highly important session. Have a fantastic evening, and please stay safe, and we hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.